Brook trout might just be the prettiest fish on the planet. They're always willing to hit a fly, and where you find one, you usually find a couple hundred more. But did you know that brook trout aren't actually a trout? And despite the fact that a lot of us probably have memories of catching little brookies, they can actually grow to enormous sizes. Plus, they're one of America's native fish. I bet the Pilgrims had a couple at Thanksgiving dinner. This week on Untangled, we're taking a deep dive into the world of brookies. You'll learn all about their life history, where they live, what they like to eat, the kind of fish that they really are, and a few tips for catching that trophy brookie of your very own.
This is Untangled, fly fishing for everyone, presented by Ventures Fly Co.
Hey everybody, welcome to it. This is Untangled, and I am your host, Spencer Durant. You know, brook trout are one of the more interesting fish that we're going to talk about in this little series where we've been taking a deep dive into different fish species. And I think we should start off before we get into anything else about brookies. We got to address the elephant in the room. The fact that brookies are a bunch of daggum liars, okay? They're not really a trout. They are their scientific name, and I apologize to any Latin speakers or biologists who listen to this show if I butcher the pronunciation here. And by the way, if you're a biologist who listens to this show, then I'm going to take that as an enormous compliment. See, Ma, I told you the fish knowledge would pay off someday. Anyways, the brook trout's scientific name is Salvelinus fontinalis. That puts them in the subfamily Salmoninae, which is part of the family Salmonidae, which is the family that's home to all of our other trout like browns, rainbows, and cutthroat. And for those who don't remember their 7th grade biology, which shout out to Mrs. Etheridge, I remember the stuff you taught me, even though you didn't think I would. When I talk about animal families, that's just the scientific classification for where these critters fall in the animal kingdom. So all of the other trout, salmon, and then char, which is what a brook trout is. That's its common name, would be the char. All of those species fall into the Salmonidae family, which means that they're all genetically related somehow. So again, your brook trout are a char, technically, which makes them very close cousins of the trout. So they look and they behave an awful lot like trout. That's why we call them trout, because they look and act that same way. The notable physical difference, though, between trout and char is that trout will always have a light body with dark spots, while char have dark bodies with light spots. And honestly, all of this really only matters to the scientists because brook trout are eating the same bugs. They're living in the same river features, same spots in the river that you'd expect, and behave very similarly to our rainbows, our browns, and our cutthroat. But you can think of this like that little bit of party trivia you can bust out when everybody else is talking about their kids' dance recitals or the insane price hike in used cars lately. Yeah, I know a used truck is $50K, but did you know that a brook trout isn't actually a trout? You drop that knowledge bomb and you're instantly going to be the most interesting person at that party. Guarantee it. Brook trout, getting back to their appearance, they will typically have a dark green to black back with a little worm-like pattern on it called vermiculation. That's another bit of party trivia you can drop. That color will fade into a darker green body. Sometimes it can be very pale, just depending on their environment and their diet. But it's going to be covered with light yellow, blue, and red spots. And then their fins are ruby red. They look super pretty. And the leading edge of their fins have a nice white tip to them. And then during spawning season, it's honestly like these fish glow. They just get so colored up. They look beautiful. And that should cover what our brook trout look like. So just like we've done with all the other installments in this series, we're going to dig into the life history of the brook trout just a little bit. Then we will take a look at some of their behaviors, their quirks, and then where you can find them. And then some tips on finding a real big brookie. Because I don't know what it is about brook trout, but the real big ones, they inspire, it's almost like a big brown trout. They inspire that same sense of awe where you're looking at something that you know, it's almost like it's rare. Because we're so used to little brookies just smashing dry flies in streams that when you see a real big one, it really is just a special sight. And then, of course, we will end with some tips on flies and some tips for catching brookies as well. So starting out with their life history, brook trout are native to a pretty interesting chunk of geography. If you take a look at a map, it's a really wide swath of geography that they're home to. But starting in the north, they're found all the way up to Hudson Bay in Canada, which is pretty far north, and then east all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. Their native range extends as far west as Minnesota. It doesn't quite get into North Dakota, but it goes pretty far that way. And then into Wisconsin and the northernmost parts of Michigan as well. It's part of their native range. And then if you go over to Maine in America, they're native from Maine south down to northern Georgia, following the Appalachian Mountains. So if you want a list of where you'll actually find them, Tennessee, North Carolina, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, New York, parts of New Jersey, all of Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Vermont, and New Hampshire are all part of their historic native range. So that is where they were originally found. But in a lot of these places, they really just occupy a tiny fraction of their historical native range, thanks to habitat loss, degradation, warming stream temperatures. It's impacting them pretty hard, because brook trout need cold, clean water, and they're pretty sensitive to pollution, and then again to those warming water temperatures. So they're not as widespread in their historical native range as they used to be, but you will find them just about everywhere else in the country, it feels like, because when we started settling the West, when we moved west as a country, we brought along a lot of things that reminded us of the East, and one of those was this native trout that, again, you think about the brown trout that were native to Europe. You come over from Europe to America and you find these little brook trout. Of course, you're going to call them a trout because they look and behave so similarly. So it's just another indication of how we ended up calling them a trout, even though genetically they're a little different. But anyways, we brought these brookies along with us to remind us of back east. And you can catch brookies now in almost every Western state. I think every Western state. I don't know for sure if Nevada has brook trout in it, but I'd be very surprised if there weren't some lakes with brook trout in Nevada somewhere. I even found some maps that indicate brook trout have been stocked in Missouri, Arkansas, parts of Alabama, and I even saw one map that indicated at some point brook trout had been planted in Texas. I do not know how legit that is, but brook trout have been dumped in tons of places throughout America's history. So it's entirely possible that at some point some Texan was like, I want brookies down on my ranch. Let's go get an order of them, put them on in here. And whether they persist today, I have no clue. If you are in Alabama and there are brook trout there, let me know. That'd be pretty cool. Go down to Alabama, catch some brookies. But it's estimated that we started stocking brookies outside of their native range as early as 1850. So we've been spreading them everywhere for, 175 years now, if my math is correct. Brookies have also been stocked in Argentina, New Zealand, Europe as well. And in Argentina in particular, there are some really nice brook trout fisheries. Fellow that I know, Dave Krasinski, fishing writer, he's got a book out called Calling After Water. Wonderful book. And he wrote about fishing for some giant brookies down in Argentina. It was one of the coolest stories that I've ever read. So go check that out if you want to hear a really awesome little brook trout story. But if you're looking for the biggest brook trout in the world, then you need to go to Labrador and Newfoundland, which both are up in Canada. And a lot of the big fish these days are coming off of the Minipie River system, which is accessed via float plane. So it's remote. It's very expensive to get in there. It's not easy to get to, but there's a very good chance that when you're up there, you're going to catch a brook trout in that 5 to 8 pound class, which is just amazing. I think my biggest brookie to date is 4 pounds. It was almost 20 inches long, but it wasn't really thick. And that's a huge brook trout. I'm stoked that's my fish. But then you look at those 8-pounders. It's literally double the size of what I caught. It's just hard to comprehend. And speaking of that, the world record brookie was a 14.5-pounder that was 31.5 inches long. It was caught on Canada's Nipigon, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, the Nipigon River by Dr. J.W. Cook in 1915. So that record has stood for 110 years, which is really impressive. More recently, though, Thomas Boyd in 2015, if I can read my notes correctly, caught a 9-pound, 10-ounce brookie off the Minipee River. So that was only 10 years ago, and that's a beautiful big fish. So there's still plenty of big brookies out there. There's still the opportunity to catch some giants if you have the means and the time to do it. But brook trout, they have this reputation where they're introduced outside of their native range for sort of taking over. And there's a few reasons for this. They'll get in and they'll just, it seems like you find one, like I said at the hook to the show, you find one, you find like 300 of them. It's how it feels. Like I said, there's a few reasons that exists. Okay. They can start spawning at about 2 years old. Although there is some research out there that tells us they can spawn at just a year old, which is much earlier than a lot of other trout species. Like a brown trout, they usually don't spawn until they're 3 years old. And then cutthroat, which won't spawn at all until they're between 3 and 5 years old. So they have to complete more years of life before they can reproduce. The brookies can just kind of go. they can get to it and make more brook trout pretty quick. And they can really overtake an area by how prolific they are at reproducing. And then another reason that they're so prolific is due to their life history itself. Take a look at a lot of the native streams that brook trout evolved in. And they're not as chock full of aquatic insects in the way a lot of the streams here in the Rockies are. Again, they're native to a lot of the far north. It's very cold. Some of the streams and lakes can be a little bit more barren. There's still food, but just not a ton. So they never really had just oodles of food at their disposal. And then on top of that, especially up north, the growing season is very short. So brook trout have evolved and adapted to become very voracious feeders. They'll just eat anything because that's hardwired into them more so than other fish that, oh, I've got a short window to eat a lot of food. I'm going to just chow down. So that's why if you find a stream full of brook trout, you really can't keep them off your line sometimes, it feels like, because they're just eating and eating and eating. It's their survival mechanism. It really gives them an advantage in the lakes, especially, and the streams here in the Rockies that don't have a whole lot of bug life. Because when we started settling out west, a lot of the lakes that we have fish in now never had fish in them. They just never, there was no way for fish to get into a lot of these lakes, especially up in the mountains. But then we started stocking, and brook trout just thrive in those cool, relatively barren environments because it's similar to what they've experienced in their life history. So this actually dovetails nicely with some tips about finding the big brook trout, which I know everybody wants to hear about. Again, I've never caught a huge brookie from a river. My biggest came out of a lake. My biggest from a river, I think, was about 15 inches, which, all things considered, that's a nice fish. I'm not sitting here like, oh, my little 15-inch brookie, it's not that big. No, I'm not being that guy. I understand that's a great fish. But when we talk big brookies, like I mentioned earlier, we think of those 20-inch 5-pounders that are shaped like footballs. That's what we're thinking of, those big ones that really just get your blood pumping, that you look at it, you think, goodness, that's an amazing fish. So if you want a really good shot at catching a brook trout like that, in my experience, you need a few things to make that happen. You need a high country lake with a good population of scuds and sap bugs, which are basically a freshwater shrimp. And then a lot of other aquatic insects as well. Because brook trout they're opportunistic, like we've discussed. They'll eat just about anything. But scuds in particular seem to just be like steroids for brookies, and they help them grow nice and big. So you need a lake that's got a lot of scuds in it so they can just chow down and get fat. The lake also needs to be spring fed or with a good inlet or outlet stream to keep the lake oxygenated throughout the winter. Because during winter, especially high elevation, when all these lakes ice up, the amount of dissolved oxygen can dwindle, and then the fish will actually suffocate because there's not enough oxygen in the water. This is called a winter kill. So if you've ever heard that phrase, that's what we're talking about. Spring-fed lakes that are relatively deep or have a good inflow or outflow stream, they usually have enough oxygen to help fish get through the winter. So you do need that. You need the fish to be able to winter over to grow large. And then the last thing that you need is a managed population of brook trout or other predators. Because when you get brookies into a lake, usually they spawn, they create a ton of fish, and then there's a whole bunch of 7-inch fish with giant heads and skinny bodies because they have eaten all the food in there and there's not enough food to feed all of those hungry mouths. And that can be really frustrating when you get into a lake like that and they're all just tiny. So what a lot of fisheries managers have actually started doing to help increase size in our brook trout lakes is stocking a sterile triploid brook trout. Now, a triploid brook trout has 3 sets of chromosomes instead of 2, so that makes them sterile. They can't reproduce. And essentially, that third chromosome acts as a supercharger for their growth, so it helps them grow bigger faster. Now, some folks might argue it's not a real brook trout at that point. The giant brook trout in the Minipee River aren't triploid. They're all wild, naturally reproducing fish, but that's a completely different environment. If we want to grow them big here in the Rockies, that seems to be something that really helps out. Either that or stocking other predators in the lakes to help keep that brook trout population in check. One thing that a lot of folks are doing now is putting tiger muskie, which is your cross between a muskie and a pike. So they're sterile, so they won't reproduce too much. But stocking a few of those in lakes, and then they eat the extra brook trout. So the brook trout that survive have more aquatic insect life to eat. They can grow a little bit bigger. So if you can find a lake that's got a managed population like that, then your odds of catching a really big brookie just go through the roof at that point. And then if you're looking to get them in rivers, it is sort of luck of the draw for finding a big brookie in a river. But fishing streams where there's less pressure and good habitat, that's always a good rule of thumb for catching a big trout. Or if there's just a lot of big fish in that river, go hit it. There might be a big brook trout in there as well. But focusing on the deeper pools and runs where big fish are going to hold regardless of what species they are, that's a great bet to find those big brookies. And then it's also good to remember that brookies are most active at dawn and dusk, very similar to our brown trout. So if you're looking for big ones, that might be a prime time to go hunt them. Now, to wrap up, let's talk about this entire concept of brook trout flies. I hear this a lot from folks who ask some variation of the question, I have a lot of this trout or this trout near me. What flies work best for them? And the answer that I give is always the same. Imitate the natural food sources in the water you're fishing. Okay. Doesn't matter where, that's the way to find the best fly for it. There's not a fly that works better for these fish or better for these fish. You need to imitate the natural food sources, and that's going to give you a good base for your fly selection. Okay. And that applies to rivers or lakes. And especially in rivers, you don't need to get crazy with your fly selection for brookies. The same stuff that your rainbows and your browns and your cutthroat eat, the brook trout are going to eat as well. And if you're completely new to the game of picking flies, we actually have a system for doing that, for picking the right fly. Even if you don't know anything at all about aquatic insects, we've made it so that you can pick the right fly and feel confident in your fly choice. We've got our Right Fly ebook that covers this, and then our fly selection masterclass. I will link both of those in the show notes for those who want to go take a look at them. So the flies themselves. When I'm going to a lake full of brookies, I'm usually going to a lake that's got a lot of scuds and leeches in it. So the flies that I like to take with me in those instances are a micro leech in sizes 10 to 14. This is basically a mini woolly bugger tied on a curved nymph hook. It's a great little leech pattern. I love to fish these as the bottom fly on a nymph rig, suspended under an indicator, over a drop off, a transition point, or a weed bed. They're very effective, or you can just strip them in very slowly by hand. Excuse me. Now, I also love marabou leeches. About an 8 to a 12 is a good size. It's a little bit bigger leech pattern. It looks a little bit more like your woolly bugger. Again, very great for stripping in between breaks and weed beds or along drop-offs where your fish are going to wait to ambush their prey. And brook trout are no different. They'll do that. A Ray Charles is a great little sow bug in a size 12 to 14. I like fishing slightly bigger sow bugs than what you normally find. I think they stand out a little bit better. I like the Ray Charles because it's really simple. You can add a bead to it. You can add some flash to it pretty easily to make it stand out. But honestly, any little scud or sow bug pattern is going to work great. And then the last thing that I don't leave without is an ice cream cone chironomid in sizes 10 to 14. And a chironomid is just a large midge. They're a must-have for lake fishing, in my opinion, because a lot of lakes have a big chironomid populations in them. So having those along can get the attention of the brook trout sometimes as well. These also work great rigged up as part of a nymph rig. And speaking of that nymph rig, what I like to do in these lakes is I like to use a slip strike indicator. So it's usually this little foam indicator, and it's designed to slip and slide down your leader all the way when you set the hook. And the advantage to this is that you can have a long leader, which is ideal for fishing deep lakes, but you can still reel that leader all the way in without the bobber stopping your fly line and the fish like 15 feet from you. If you've ever been nymphing with a longer leader and you reel that bobber all the way in, you can't reach the fish. You're trying to reach and pull your rod back, and it's just this awkward dance. The slip strike indicator removes that problem by just sliding down. So I like to use that. And then I usually go anywhere from 5 to 10 feet below that first bobber, that bobber with my first fly, just depending on the depth of the lake that I'm fishing. And then I will tie that first fly on using a non-slip mono loop because I like how that knot helps the flies bounce and move in the lake. I think it looks very realistic. And then I'll usually tie my second fly about 2 feet below that first fly, and I'll use a loop knot there as well. And then my leader, again, my leader to my first fly is usually at least 10 feet long, so I can tweak that depth from deep to shallow throughout the day as the fish move and as I move around the lake. If you want to learn a little bit more about lake fishing, I know that was like a crash course in it. I've actually done a podcast on that in the past. I'll go ahead and link that in the show notes as well. But with that, folks, I hope you enjoyed learning more about brook trout. If you've got any more questions about the brookies, please let me know. But it is time to move on to the Q&A section of this week's show.
Nothing is worse than hooking into a big fish only to have your knot break halfway through the fight. Setting up your rod and tying knots can be confusing and frustrating, especially if you're unsure if it's going to work. That's why we put together our Rigs and Knots Pocket Guide. It has instructions and tips on how to set up the most time-tested, proven, reliable fly fishing rigs step by step. So if you want to spend less time tinkering and more time fishing with confidence, click or tap the link in the show notes to get this guide for free. All right, back to the show.
Every week here at Untangled, we spend half the show directly answering questions from listeners and viewers just like yourself. So if you've got a fly fishing question that you would like answered, you can go ahead and send that in to me. It's at the link in the show notes. I love getting the questions and hear from y'all. They are what runs Untangled, so make sure you keep sending those on into us. And the first question this week comes to us from Bryce from Pennsylvania. Writes in and says, I'm having trouble seeing my dry flies in the water. Would it be okay if I tied on an indicator about 2 feet away from the fly, or would this spook the fish? Bryce, we get this question a lot, so thanks for sending it in again. It's always great to revisit this topic. The short answer here is no. I don't like putting an indicator on my leader at all when I'm fishing dry flies. But as always, there's a long answer to this. And then, of course, there's an exception, because it wouldn't be fly fishing if there wasn't an exception. Because, again, I'm telling you what I would do. I'm giving you the general advice I would give anybody, but there are no rules in fly fishing. As long as you get the fly in front of the fish and make it look real, doesn't matter how you do it. That's just your job. That is your job, is to get it in front of the fish, make it look real. So let's review with that context. What are we trying to do when we're presenting a smaller dry fly? And I'm assuming that we're talking about smaller dry flies here, because usually the bigger dry flies are easier to see, like our hoppers or our bigger caddis. But our smaller dries, what are we trying to do with those? Well, often we want that dry fly to drift naturally with the current, so we don't want any drag on it. And all drag is, for those who may not know, is it's unnatural movement on your fly. You want that dry fly to drift with the current so it looks like a real bug. If there's drag, you'll see this little wake behind it, because it means it's being pulled often by your leader or your fly line in a direction that's going against the current. You don't want that. You want a drag-free drift. Most of the time, you want a drag-free drift with your dry flies. And then again, when I say that most of the time you want a drag-free drift with your dry flies, sometimes when you're fishing your big foam bugs, like your hoppers or your crickets or your stoneflies, sometimes they do benefit from just a little bit of movement on the water. I was out with my buddy Blair years ago. We were out fishing and we were getting our butts kicked on this river. So we went into town, went into a fly shop, asked for some help. This guy hands us a couple of chubby Chernobyls and says, yeah, slap it on the water real hard and then just twitch it. I looked at him like he was an idiot, because I'd heard all my life, you got drag-free drift. You got to do it. You got to do it. So I listened to him though, went up, slapped that hopper on the water, twitched it, and boom, got into fish just like that, literally on the first cast. It was incredible. So sometimes you will benefit from a little twitch, but that's very rarely going to be the case with your small dry flies. Your small dry flies, you want that drag-free drift. By adding a strike indicator to your leader with that small dry fly, you are potentially adding something extra that the current can pull on, which could cause drag on your fly. That's why I don't want to use them. Second, if you're fishing your little dry flies, I'm assuming that the fish are actively looking up. They're actively feeding. If they see this big bobber laying on the water, you do run the risk of spooking them, because that's not the shape and size of the mayflies or the caddis or the midges that are coming off. So that's going to tell the fish, there's something here that's just not right, and it can put them down. So that's why I don't add indicators to any of my dry fly rigs. That's why I don't recommend folks add indicators to their dry fly rigs. I think it introduces more problems than it solves. But the exception to this is something that I've seen a few folks use. They enjoy it. It seems to work well for them. But there are these little pinch-on foam indicators. It's literally just this tiny piece of foam, but it's a bright color. They're very small, and they literally just pinch right onto your leader. They don't cause hardly any drag at all, and they do help some folks locate where their flies are. So if you feel like you really do need that indicator, that's an option. Berkeley, part of the team here at VFC, he actually uses them. Alex has seen him use them successfully. So it's not something that I'm like, oh, I heard a guy that used this once on this river. It's, folks I know who use it. I just don't like doing it. What I like to do, in my experience, this works the best for me, is just fishing a double dry fly rig. So if I've got that tiny little dry fly, what I'll do is I'll take a larger fly up ahead of it. So if, let's say, I was just on the river yesterday, I was fishing a blue winged olive hatch, and they were pretty small. So I put a size 14 parachute blue wing on as my first fly, and then I had about 18 inches of tippet, and I went to a size 16 blue wing cripple, a very small fly, not very small, but a smaller fly behind that, because that cripple sits lower in the water. It can be really hard to see, but that 14 parachute, it's not out of the realm of what's on the water. It's a blue winged olive. It's the right shape. It's the right color. It's a little bit bigger in size, but so I'm not counting on that to actually catch a lot of fish for me. It's serving mostly as an indicator. I can watch where that fly is, and then I can see the cripple behind it. Or if I can't see the cripple at all, I can still watch that bigger parachute. And if it moves or dunks, I know to set the hook because the fish ate the cripple. And then sometimes they will just hit that bigger fly. I had a couple of fish yesterday, even though most of the blue wings were 16s and 18s on the water, I had a couple eat that 14 anyways. And then the last thing I want to end with here is that learning to spot your flies on the water it's as much of a skill as anything else in fly fishing. So the more time that you spend fishing your dry flies, the better you're going to get at spotting the smaller ones out on the water. One trick you can use is try and watch exactly where your leader lands and then follow that leader up to your fly. Sometimes that can help as well. But I really appreciate the question. Thanks so much for sending it in. Pete from Vermont has our next question, writes in and says, just finished listening to episode 106. During the podcast, you mentioned making a change in depth or a tiny change in your setup, possibly changing the color and or size of the fly. Once you make these changes, do you fish the same area you have been fishing again, or are you moving to another spot? As you make these changes, what is the next thing you do? As you say, observe, make small changes, then what? Finally, when fishing a San Juan worm, how do you fish it? Pete, good questions. Good to hear from you. So when I make changes to my rig, I absolutely run my flies back through the water that I was just fishing because that's the first opportunity I have to get feedback on whether the changes I made were correct. About a month ago, I was fishing with two buddies of mine, and I was hitting this seam between a rapid and the bank and some of that calmer water there. And my buddy Eugene had already caught two fish that morning from very similar water, and I hadn't caught anything yet. So the pressure was on. I was working this seam thoroughly. I was fishing close to far, doing all the things that we teach here at VFC, but my bobber wasn't ticking along the bottom at all, and I wasn't getting hung up on anything. So that was telling me that I probably wasn't deep enough. So I bring my line in. I moved the bobber up about a foot so that my flies are drifting deeper. I threw right back into that seam, the same spots I was fishing just 5 minutes before. And on like my second or third cast, I hooked into a beautiful brown trout. So whenever I make fly or rig changes, I always throw back into the water I was fishing to get some feedback on those changes. I'll move on at that point because I know a lot of folks say, well, how long do you fish it before you move on? My goal is I want to get a half dozen at least really good drifts that I feel like that's the best drift I possibly could. That's the best presentation I could possibly get. And I like to do that for every piece of the water. So if you're fishing a run, for example, I'll do that for the whole run with my flies before I move on. And if I've done half a dozen good ones and nothing's happened, then I'll just say, all right, there's either not fish right here or they just aren't hungry or maybe something else is wrong, but I'll move on at that point. I'll try and find new water and fresh fish just to see and get more feedback on whether or not the changes I made to my rig are correct. So that's how I approach that. I make the changes, I fish it. I put the effort into to get my drifts as good as I possibly can. Once I feel like I've done that at least half a dozen times, then I'll go ahead and move on. And as far as fishing a San Juan worm, or any worm pattern, really, it's just another nymph. That's how you want to fish them. I know some anglers who will fish them in still water and they'll strip them in on really slow retrieves. But if you're fishing a worm in a river, just tie it onto your rig the same way that you would tie any other nymph on, and then just let it drift. You don't need any special technique or anything. You're just letting it drift and move with the water. The only thing that I like to do with my worms is they're generally going to be found lower in the water column. So I usually put it as the bottom fly in my rig, just because that's where worms are most commonly found. So I want them down deep. One little pro tip here is that whatever material you're using to tie those worms with, whether it's a squirmy worm or it's chenille, it causes a lot of drag as that fly sinks down. So you might have to add a little bit of extra weight to help them get down They don't sink as nicely as a perdigone or zebra midge. It's very streamlined. It doesn't have a bunch of stuff hanging off of it. So hopefully that helps. Pete, thanks so much for sending in the question. Brad from Montana has our next question, writes in and says, I have listened to all the episodes of the podcast and really enjoyed them. My question is about flies like the iconic Royal Coachman or the Humpy. You never mention them, and I was wondering why. They are my go-to when the fish are rising. They're a pain to tie, but my favorite. Thanks again. Brad, good question. Oh, I don't mention them because they're bad flies. No, I'm kidding. They're great flies. But before we answer this question, let's cover a concept real quick. I want to make sure we're all clear on this. Most flies are going to fall into one of three buckets. They can be realistic flies, which are tied to look as close as possible to the real thing. They're designed to make you look at the fake fly and the real fly and go, I can't tell the difference. It's like that Office meme. Corporate wants you to find the difference between these two flies. There is no difference. That's the vibe that these realistic flies are going for. An example of this could be your zebra midge, which looks very, very similar to a real midge, or any worm pattern, because again, they just look very similar to the real life thing. The next thing they could be is what we call a suggestive fly, which it's tied to vaguely look like the bug, but it's not trying to imitate it exactly. It doesn't want to be the exact thing. A good example here would be your parachute Adams, because it looks a lot like a mayfly, but not exactly like a mayfly. A pheasant-tailed nymph is another great example, because it looks like a mayfly nymph, but it's not an exact match. It's not as short, or it's not as long, or it's not as skinny, or doesn't have as many legs, or whatever you want to pick at. It looks really close to it, though. And then last, you've got your attractor flies. And these are tied to be about the same size and shape as a real bug, but they use very flashy materials or bright colors. They're trying to get a fish's attention by adding some contrast and some pizzazz to the whole thing. So your humpies and your Royal Coachman, they are attractor patterns, although you could make the case that the Coachman could probably imitate a stonefly, and I bet works pretty well during a stonefly hatch. So I wouldn't use a Coachman or a Humpy during technical match the hatch situations, because they don't look a whole lot like our mayflies, our caddis, or our midges. Now, they're both going to be great, I think, when the stoneflies are on, but there's not a whole lot of technical match the hatch skill going on when you've got stoneflies coming off, thankfully. That's one of the reasons everybody loves the stonefly hatches, because you can just slap a big bug out there and do pretty well. But both your Royal Coachman and your Humpy, they float very high. They're very easy to see, especially in fast, riffly water, which is a huge benefit. So if you're up on a high mountain stream and you're wanting to run a dry dropper rig through some riffles, it's hard to beat how great a Royal Coachman or a Humpy work in that situation. Now, reason I don't talk about these flies a whole lot is that my personal fly selection, I tend to be a lot more suggestive with my fly choice, so I don't have a lot of attractor patterns. I like to fish bugs that are a bit more lifelike. The furthest I really stray from that is probably a chubby Chernobyl or like a Prince nymph, I guess. Because that chubby, it's still got the same size and shape as a hopper or stoneflies, but that's really where it ends in looking like them. That's just how I like to fish. Those are the flies that I like to use. They tend to work very well for me. But there's absolutely nothing wrong with using attractor flies, especially in the summer. But that's just why I don't really bring them up a whole lot. They're just not something that I use on a consistent basis. So thanks so much for sending that question in. And with that, folks, we're going to move on to the Live Real Life moment of this week's show. Every week, we end the show by sharing a story from listeners and viewers out there in the audience. We love to hear about your fishing stories and to hear about you living real life. So if you've got a Live Real Life moment that you'd like to send in, there is a link to do that in these show notes. And this week's Live Real Life moment is from Chris. Writes in and says, "Hi, Spencer and VFC crew. First, thank you for everything you all put out. I've learned so much in such a short time. I continue to keep hammering podcast episodes and YouTube videos. Sometimes I even watch after a day on the water, which makes me want to turn around and try to catch the monsters I bounced flies off of early in the day. I am 2 months into self-taught fly fishing, but have dabbled briefly in the last year and a half. The lack of knowledge in the sport was a bit overwhelming, and I didn't feel like I belonged. Zero clue of, well, anything. I am all in now, addicted, stoked on all things fly fishing. So much so that I almost faked my own death in order to not go back to my offshore job, which ultimately lined up this fall from September to the end of November. Dang it. Anyway, I have been out with a buddy of mine more than a few times now, catching small brookies, a few Arctic grayling, cutthroats, rainbows, etc. It wasn't until recently that I started to catch bigger fish, and man, where has fly fishing been all my life? This fish is my current PB and it netted one day before I left for 3 months of work offshore. The second of similar size was caught and lost later on that day. Still crying / laughing about that one. I'll see you on the water. Cheers and tight lines. Chris, I commend the dedication. And I'd be curious to hear about how you almost faked your own death. That sounds brilliant. I may or may not need that the next time my mother-in-law wants to go fishing with me. No, I'm kidding. That's a fantastic story, man. I love it. I love hearing the fervor that you've got for this. It's so cool. And you articulated it so well, what so many of us feel that, man, where has fly fishing been all my life? That's a great line. You just did a wonderful job of explaining, I think, why a lot of us fall in love with this. So thank you so much for sending that in. And with that, folks, we are going to wrap the show up this week. Thank you so much for being here with us. It means a ton. And if you could, take a minute to rate and subscribe to the show wherever you're listening to it. The more ratings and subscriptions we get, the more folks we can help live real life. And speaking of living real life, we've got a whole bunch of content designed to help you do just that. So click on the links wherever you see them, watch some more of our stuff, and until next week, get out on the water, take advantage of the good dry fly fishing that's going on, and live real life.